over and over again yesterday when we were talking about the stakeholder stuff is issues of biodiversity, of increasing biodiversity, of no net loss in biodiversity, and the problem is we keep talking about biodiversity as if we knew what it meant, as if it was a single, easily measured parameter. And the problem with biodiversity is a complicated thing. I mean, if you go back to any sort of ecological textbook, you all know it's multiple biotic scales, essentially, from genetic diversity within a population to population size and species viability to community species richness to functional diversity and ecosystem, and there's a whole range of biotic scales. But in addition to that, there are also questions of spatial scales that mess things up, right? and make things complicated, because often it's not straightforward to know what is the object you're trying to measure, and how, and an easy way to draw lines around it, or to describe its behavior. And a lot of that is mathematically interesting, I think, and also maybe practically important. And so essentially the question is what it is exactly we're trying to manage for no net loss or for whatever. A lot of the way we tend to treat populations is as if they look like this. There are simple landscapes with well-defined, probably rectangular populations with uniform densities inside them and discrete communities that differ abruptly in space. And to a certain extent, our actions as a species have to impose this on the world more than it was naturally there. But nonetheless, even in our patchwork quilt of habitats, things are messier than we'd like to believe. The real world is heterogeneous, even within managed patches. There are poorly defined populations. You can kind of spot some of them there just by the differences in leaf color. There are varying densities of species within those patches. There are poorly defined communities that intergrade one into the other. It's a mess. And we need to somehow deal with that if we're going to try to actually take seriously the challenge of managing biodiversity. So I'm going to quickly talk about some issues about spatial population ecology, and then some principles of spatial and actually temporal biodiversity science, and interspersed with that will be various pet obsessions and things that I think of as problems that may need some more work. And I've color-coded all those in sort of brown, so you can spot what I think you should all be doing. So essentially, populations are themselves messy and multi-scaled. Right? And the classic one from the 1940s is this work on a clematis species in the Ozark Mountains of the central United States. It this is from a boring bit of East Anglia, and nonetheless you can see that this is a where's my pointer here? Okay, it doesn't point. Never mind. I can point. I've got this pointer. This particular species is restricted to East Anglia in the UK. Within that population, we actually surveyed, I think it was 10 1 kilometer squares of it. Each one of those we have the species mapped out to hectares. Within those hectares we subsampled them and mapped them out to 10 meter squares. Within those 10 meter squares we mapped them out to meter squares, and actually within those meter squares we mapped them out to centimeters. And all those scales, these populations are patchy, they're aggregated. Until you get to very, very fine scales where individuals may be somewhat spaced out just because they occupy space. You can try to digest all of that in some sort of way, and the way I've done it over time is using what I call scale area curves, but now the literature calls them occupancy area relationships, OARs. And there's a couple of different ways you can do them. There's the way biologists tend to like them, which is where you're looking at the total area occupied by a species as a function of scale. The way mathematicians tend to like it is the number of occupied cells as a function of scale. But in either way, you can see that these are two different species, and you can see that the two species are behaving rather differently across scales. Right? And the 17 species we've done this to all behave in their own different characteristic ways. Right? One of the consequences of that aggregation is that most individuals live at higher densities than the mean field density. First of all, actually, that one consequence of this multi-scaled patchiness is that each individual doesn't have one thing called a density. Certainly a population doesn't have a density. An individual doesn't even have a density, but it has a whole spectrum of scale-specific densities. And different individuals in the same population so these different colors are different populations. In that red population, you can see some different individuals were living at very different densities at fine scales. At coarse scales, the different individuals in the same population tend to converge onto some sort of mean field density. Right? What is causing all this weird scaling stuff? Well, this is all make-believe now with the next couple of slides. But in fact, you can imagine that there's some sort of fitness map out there. If you could just interview the species, you get some sort of lambda map of how well it would do in different parts of the landscape. And then you can imagine thresholding that at where lambda is above replacement, and the population could have a viable population there. And that habitat map itself would have scaling properties. It would be a complicated thing. It wouldn't be rectangles. Right? Then your population inhabiting that filters it by its own dispersal and local extinction probabilities. So the species will live in some places that aren't really habitat, but that are near habitat and aren't too bad, where there's a slight negative growth rate and you have sink populations growing in those places. And that adds space at fine scales, because all those places by definition are near places that were already occupied. Right? On the other hand, there are places that are small and isolated that probabilistically won't be occupied most of the time. And those places lose you area at coarse scales, right? But they don't lose you much area at fine scales because they're small. Right? So these population processes reshape the scaling distribution of habitat from the intrinsic one that's out there. Right? Then if these species have these individuals are living at different densities, that also creates a density dependence situation. And density dependence has been sort of something that ecologists have drink with their mother's milk when they're first learning ecology. And we all study this, but actually since each individual is living at different densities, and each individual has different densities, different scales, different processes that are density dependent may be responding to density at different scales. And it turns out if you test it, this is a huge, nasty experiment that involves planting out 14,000 campion plants in a field in Yorkshire. You can find out that actually different processes are responding at different scales. And if density dependence in the old-fashioned scale-vague way can regulate populations or make them chaotic and do all the fun stuff that we do in population models, then these multiple density feedbacks operating on different scales themselves ought to be serving a role in the molding of these populations, but we don't really know how. That's cool maths, I think, but I'm not a mathematician, so I can't tell you. Then this process of all these things affecting scales shows up in species range. If you actually look at distribution maps, both for butterflies and for plants, the two things we've actually done this on, the most important correlate of spatial scaling in the population of the sort of, you can see these two species are about equally common in terms of occupancy at a 10-kilometer scale, but that one's much clumpier and that one's much more diffuse, right? And it turns out across both plants and butterflies, the ones that are diffuse, like that one, are declining species, almost always. And the ones that are clumpy like that are mostly expanding species. Right? And so there's something about the dynamics of species moving across space or going extinct that changes the scaling patterns of their populations. Right? And my guess is it's something like metapopulations at disequilibrium, that there are populations here that when that population goes extinct, it will not be recolonized. It's too far away from any other populations, but it can persist there for quite a while before it goes extinct. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the point is that then there may be ways to understand how the dynamics of abundance change or distributional change will end up affecting these scaling patterns. Right? So if we turn these back into these occupancy area relationships, or another temptation of this is you might be able to actually extrapolate these down to the finer scales where you really would be talking about populations. So this is stuff I did years ago, but anyhow, I'll talk about it now. There are a bunch of methods people have tried. Can we predict occupancy at finer scales than our data? Can we ideally predict population sizes from distributions? Or are there limits to that extrapolation, which gets us back to the question we have over there about limits of uncertainties and things. There are a lot of methods out there. My original method actually doesn't do all that well. But by now there are lots of other methods, including that one up there, which my colleague Sandra Basaele did, and it works pretty well. You can also do consensus models using multiple things and trying to work out an overall prediction, and that works even better. But even so, there are some issues about these things. There are so this is back to that to that set of 17 species we've done it for. There are coherent scaling regimes where things tend to behave similarly at different scales. But then there's at least here a valley, a disjunction in the scaling relationships between about half a kilometer and a kilometer. And my guess is that's the footprint of human land use. I said before that we as a species are trying very hard to make the world cut into rectangular blocks. And those blocks of ownership or of management tend to be about the sort of scale where the scaling relationship breaks down. So how is that percolating through to the behavior of ecological systems? We don't really know. If we've got these scaling down methods, they have a proven ability to tell us something about how common things are at finer scales than our data, but they don't tell us anything at all about where those things are. On the other hand, there are a bunch of methods out there, species distribution models, that are trying to tell you what is good and bad habitat for a species using all sorts of fancy statistical machinery, right? And those look at niche stuff, but they tend to ignore the spatial pattern of stuff. And that's part of their weakness. There's a number of papers that criticize them for essentially being fooled by spatial autocorrelation. It ought to be possible to put those two together, and just like Marilyn Monroe, apparently this is probably apocryphal, told Einstein, "I want to have your child with my looks and your brains. It'll be a perfect child." And Einstein pointed out, "But what happened if it had my looks and your brains?" And that is the problem with these attempts. But I think the issue of trying to come up with a hybrid model that puts together the powers of downscaling and the powers of species distribution model is an open goal there, waiting for someone to figure out how to do it. Okay, so we've been talking so far about species populations or species distributions at multiple scales. Essentially, when you add those species distributions up and just stack them on top of each other, you produce these document area relationships sum to make the species area relationship, which everyone knows about. Right? The biodiversity as a function of scale. And actually, one of the weirder results of recent years is that it actually doesn't matter the correlation structure between the different species. So these two species are very negatively correlated, and they produce that species area relationship with those sorts of confidence intervals. Anyhow, the same things if we turn it to a positive correlation. You still have exactly the same species area relationship. It's just that the confidence intervals get wider, because now we have more cells that are zeros and more cells that are 2 and fewer cells that are 1. Right? These species area relationships then are kind of the basic tool for talking about lots of community level biodiversity patterns as a function of scale. Because essentially it's the original scaling tool in biodiversity science. Effectively, this is not very surprising, the less area you have, the fewer species you have, right? That's partly a sampling phenomenon. It's partly an environmental phenomenon. But various reasons for what we can talk about. It tends to it is a universal, and one of the useful properties of it is always scales less than additively. So twice as much area has less than twice as many species, right? And so and that ends up having consequences later on. The other thing is that if you go from samples out of a continuous block of habitat into isolated samples in a matrix of something else, right? It both pushes down the species area relationship and makes it steeper, right? Now it doesn't do that instantaneously. If we were to wipe out all that background instantly, it takes a while for these things to happen, and effectively you have these two phenomena. There's extinction debt, which is relatively well studied, and that when you lose all that habitat, it takes a while for the species richness to reach what will be its new endpoint. And if you create new habitat, it takes a while for it to achieve its full potential, partly for the developmental reasons we talked about a bit yesterday, that if you plant a forest, it isn't really a forest until they actually get trees there, you know, and it takes a while for it to become functionally a forest. But even once it's functionally, even it starts looking like a forest, it's got closed canopy, it's got shade underneath, it'll take a while for forest species to find it. Right? And that's the colonization credit. It will increase in its value over time, but the scaling of that is not really well understood. There's been a bit more work lately So another big topic I think we need to talk about is how we incorporate these time lags into our landscape decision making. Right? Some of these time lags can be quite long. This is some work from John Halley and Nyo Iwasa, where they were looking at, they put together all the data they could find on measured extinction debts, and as a function of patch size, and essentially the T50s, the time it took to lose half the species, varied massively with patch size. You notice this on a log scale, a log scale, so that if we talk about things that are above about 1,000 hectares, we're talking about centuries before they've gotten halfway through their extinction debt. Right? So when we're talking about large patches, are these politically relevant timescales? I'm not sure. But a lot of what we're talking about in places like Britain are small patches of a hectare or 10 hectares, and that sort of place, actually these things are politically relevant. This is really basic stuff. You all know about alpha, beta, and gamma, but just in case there's some people out there who don't, back in the early 70s, Robert Whitaker suggested that we could talk about alpha diversity as the diversity of a notionally uniform site, beta diversity as the turnover between sites, and gamma diversity then as a sort of landscape scale diversity. So most of this whole, we could rename this conference gamma diversity, right? Anyhow, but a lot of what we talk about in terms of the agro-environment literature, certainly, and other bits of biodiversity management, is measured its effects are measured in terms of how they affect alpha, right? You do this sort of management, or you do that sort of management, and the number of species in your woodlot increases or decreases or whatever happens, right? If we can come up with a single best practice, if, for instance, the entry-level stewardship guidelines about how you should manage your hedgerows had been based on some science, which they may have been, I'm not sure, I should talk to someone at DEFRA, the fact that all the entry-level stewardship farms across the country were all managing their hedgerows in the same way creates, even if it is best practice, it creates uniformity. It reduces beta diversity. If it makes every place more similar, it may be that on balance it helps more species than it hurts, but it helps those same species everywhere. And it hurts the same species everywhere. And one example of that, the best one I know about so far, is the Danube clouded yellow butterfly, which is that one. I've never seen one. Its major stronghold in Europe was an area in the Carpathian Mountains in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as was then. And when they joined the European Union, they took their messy agricultural practices and introduced agro-environment schemes. And so rather than each farmer mowing their hay meadow when they got around to it, they all had to mow it in the same window of time, because that was the best time for avoiding damage to breeding birds. And in doing so, they drove this butterfly extinct. Right? Because all the farms were all mowing their meadows at the same time, and there were no refuges for the places where what are they called? Caterpillars, that's the word. The caterpillars of these butterflies would survive the hay mow. And so they managed to, by doing the same thing everywhere, they drove a critically endangered species locally extinct, or regionally extinct. So how do we find incentive schemes that actually incentivize diverse management without at the same time incentivizing bad management? And that, I think, is a balancing act that's really more for the social scientists or whatever than it is for the biologists, but it is a real challenge. And also, can we then create flexible instruments that, as we discover we're doing something bad, can learn from, okay, actually we now need some of these places to be managed differently, or the weightings for different habitats need to change over time, so that we can improve our management over time. Another piece of this is that what happens on a site is not just a function of how that site is managed. This is some data from a study we were doing on organic and conventional farms in a couple parts of England, and we looked at organic farms that were in landscapes where they were the only organic farm, organic farms that were in landscapes where there were lots of other organic farms around, and also conventional farms where they were in landscapes with very few organic farms, and conventional farms were in their landscapes with lots of organic farms around. And it turns out, for different organisms, the relative effects of local management, whether this farm was organic or not, were sometimes less strong than the effects of the landscape levels of it, and largely was a question of mobility. So for plants and earthworms, local management was far more important than landscape management. But for birds and solitary bees, landscape management was more important than local management, right? So both of these things are important, and their relative importance depends to a certain extent on mobility. So are there ways we can incorporate these multi-scale aspects of how the landscape affects the species, but also how local management contributes to the landscape level conservation? There are methods, and I'm mentioning Spake's paper because it's a nice paper, as one example of work in this space. Right. Another problem, and this is another personal obsession of mine, which is the issue of can we upscale, can we find ways to talk about these coarser scale aspects of biodiversity by taking local samples? We can't get comprehensive samples, right? And the problem is that, well, if we're trying to upscale things like carbon, that's easy. We can look at how much carbon is sequestered in each hectare and just sum it by the hectares, or because it's be different hectares, we can do some sort of stratified sum, but ultimately it is an additive process. The total amount sequestered is the sum of all the amounts being sequestered in all the different spots. Right? But biodiversity, that's not true. If you've got two places, each with 10 species, you might only have 10 species altogether if the two places have the same species. You might have 20 species if they have completely non-overlapping sets of species, right? Or you can have something in between. When you have, as you start getting more sites than just two, it gets much more complicated. There's a whole sort of machinery of zeta diversity that Kang Hui has come up with, and it's cool stuff. But it gets complicated to talk about how we measure the relative contribution then of the marginal advantage of adding particular spots to not just adding new species, but adding viability for some of the species that are so far poorly represented in the rest of the mix. And all that sort of thing is a complicated task, and that's further complicated by the fact that we always have incomplete samples. So it might be that these three sites each had 50 species, but our samples from them may only get 20 of those species, right? And that the bits that are showing up in our samples may be a non-random set. In general, we will find the common species in our sampling. The rare species that are also there may not fall into our pitfall trap or our pan trap or whatever. And as a consequence, we will see more overlap, usually, in the species we find than in the species set there. So the ones that are important for conservation are often these ones that aren't in the sample. So it's a complicated issue then about how we then can use these sorts of samples to draw inferences about the whole from which they came. Right? So the question is there a way to estimate this species area relationship from scattered point samples that are cleverly stratified and whatever, right? Why would you want to do it? First of all, you might want to be able to monitor change at multiple scales to see how our policy is affecting biodiversity at regional, national, and local scales. We might want to be estimating richness for taxa that are poorly studied, like the beetles of the Amazon. We might want to try to extrapolate up fine-scale research results, like this guy's little grazing exposure, to draw inferences about all of Britain or something, right? There are a lot of methods out there. The whole idea was first proposed by John Hart back in 1999, and since then there's been a fairly recent proliferation of new ideas. And some of them are sort of idealized things which are efficient. They can use, they're based on some sort of high theory that tells you how things ought to behave, and with relatively little data you can parameterize those models and get predictions, right? Other ones are very descriptive. They need a lot of data to parameterize them properly, but they're relatively robust. And there's a couple examples of those. To try to test these, we went and looked at countryside survey, which is just about the best stratified random sample of countryside that I know of any place on Earth, and looked both at the full data set and different subsets of it, so we had more than one data set. Then we used these different upscaling methods and tried to estimate the true species area relationship for plants in the UK, which was a massive upscaling. We're basically looking at a 14 billion-fold larger object than the size of the quadrat, or 500,000 times bigger than the total sample set. Right? And the short answer is there's a huge variety of outcomes. Some got very, very high. The dark purple there is the actual species area relationship. some were exceptionally low, actually far fewer species than there were in the data set, which when you think about it is a really bold forecast. Some actually got more or less the right number of species at the top, but were very different in shape, much flatter. And some of them more or less got the right shape, but weren't always the best ones for getting the right species. So at this point, we've got a series of models which do okay. So this is the 16 different data sets that we tried them on, and as you can see, some like Shen and Hay do a pretty good job, right? And Kang Hui's ORC, I forgot what ORC stands for. All right, some other. This is the old-fashioned way. If we were doing this trick back in the 1970s, we would say, of course, we would use the canonical power law. We know that species richness rises as a power law with a canonical slope of 0.25, and that would give us this answer, completely uncorrelated with the actual richness of these different sample sites. That's right. But that said, there's still a lot of room for improvement, so I put that in brown too. Okay, but again, I started out by saying biodiversity is a complicated thing. Conservation has lots of different goals. We're interested in conserving genetic diversity. We're interested in population viability. We're interested in community richness. We're interested in ecosystem service delivery. Do the same landscape configurations deliver all those goods? Right? And if not, can we somehow find solutions that do pretty well for all of them, even if it's not the same optimum? Right? So we ended up using a series of best models we could find for some of these things, and threw at them a series of make-believe and real landscapes. Some of these are maps from the National Forest Inventory. Some of these are maps to give us different sorts of distributions that weren't in the inventory. And some of these were 10% habitat, and some of these were 2% habitat. And we varied anyhow. But that we then did all these different processes in all these different places, and this wonderful 5-dimensional graph is actually showing you all those results. Effectively, first of all, we find that more is always better than less. Those are all the 2% landscape solutions. Those are all the 10% landscape solutions, and you can see that in general, you do better on all these criteria by having more land. So that's good, right? Among the different good ones, the ecosystem services, which are that axis, we're delivering much more in diffuse lists of things, because essentially they've got more interface with the matrix to export these pollination services out to the surrounding landscapes, right? Species richness was maximized in fairly dispersed networks. Population viability was maximized in fairly clumped networks, right? And genetic diversity, which was indicated here by the size and color of the balls, is maximized in fairly clumped, especially the heterozygosity in very clumped landscapes, right? You can try to add all this up. There's actually no obvious way to add them without in the same units, but this is just sort of adding up the ranks. And what you find basically is that in the 10% solutions, there's sort of a moderate level of subdivision, which does pretty well. Even though it's not the best for any of these processes, it doesn't do too badly for any of them, and so it might be a good consensus solution. On the other hand, if you can only afford 2% of the land to be conserved, then you want it all in one place, right? So it turns out that at least in this very simplified version of this stuff, the answer you get depends a bit on how much you can afford to spend, right? Which is also anyhow. But all of this is really primitive stuff. The issue of how we do multi-parameter, multiple aspects of biodiversity, integrate all of them into our planning decisions, I think is a big and open question. So in summary, biodiversity enhancement is complicated and multifaceted. Populations are spatially complex. Density is scale dependent. There still needs to be better tools for understanding spatial dynamics. Species richness patterns are multi-scaled in space and time. Potentially long lags in biodiversity responses to change need to be thought about. Spatial beta variation is vital for landscape biodiversity. Richness can be upscaled, but only sort of fuzzily so far. And different goals require different strategies, but we can still find pretty good solutions that do most of them. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll happily answer any questions.
Thanks to your speedy delivery, I think we're actually ahead of time, so we've got plenty of time for some questions.
I could have added 10 more of those slides that I left out.
Guy.
Thank you, Bill. This is amazing. How to follow with so much information. It's some time to digest. I mean, you've rightfully said that a lot of the agro-environmental schemes actually ignore all that when they, incentivize management. But do you have any working solutions? Do you have any proposals how to actually, use some of this in the way we develop new aims?
Partly. At this point, I can absolutely see. The one I've been thinking about lately, because we've been having conversations about it, is this question about net biodiversity gain. That's not so much in great big landscape decisions, although it has landscape aspects. That's largely about this, trading off one action against another, right? And at relatively fine scale. But the notion that you can just use habitat type as a proxy for biodiversity is a pretty crude instrument, but I can see why they do it, because actually being able to, you can spend your lifetime on a decent plot and still be finding new species, in the n+1 time. So it's I can see why you do it. On the other hand, there isn't. I've heard a talk of a environmental consultant who was trying to do mitigation for a highway taking out a species-rich calcareous meadow, and they took out the species-rich calcareous meadow and they moved the land, they moved the soil out someplace else and plopped it down. And guess what? It wasn't MG3 before, and it was MG3 afterwards. Therefore, they had mitigated it because they had 2 hectares of MG3, and now they had 2.5 hectares of MG3. Gosh, biodiversity was better off. Well, no one was asking whether it was as good an MG3 as it was before. Almost certainly the rare species that were there, the beetles or the whatever, didn't make it with the soil. And so the notion that we can just use habitat to cover all these sins, I don't know. So the answer is, do I have an answer that will solve the problem? No. But I think we need to be thinking seriously about it. I think we need to be, as a community, or possibly build into the instrument, and this would be really cool if we can find a mechanism that would do it, have some sort of learning that improves the instrument over time. So for instance, I don't know what's going to happen with the zero net biodiversity loss target. I know what happens with agro-environment schemes, and you have a menu of different options, and everyone does the cheapest ones. And so even though there's lots and lots of options, in fact, everyone does the same thing. Of those different high priority habitats, on essentially the zero net loss stuff is based on, there's this upper tier of habitats that are really, you get lots of points for, the next tier that you get some points for, and everything else is considered garbage. So someone's going to find, okay, of the medium rank ones, that one's the cheapest one to make. And everyone's going to make that. Because by the calculator, it's going to be the one, or it may be that in the south that's the cheapest one, and in the north that's the cheapest one. But effectively, it's going to create a lot of people doing the same thing. It's going to produce a lot of one mediocre habitat, and it's going to be of almost zero biodiversity value, probably. And we'll find that out afterwards. But if there was some sort of way that we could be keeping track of this stuff, and first of all, ideally not just have 2 tiers of things, but have some sort of ranking of habitats or something. You get more and more points as you get to things that matter more. And that's a live list, so the planner doing their planning thing will put in their things and they'll get their calculations out, and it may be different than they would have gotten a year ago, but too bad. And as certain habitats get taken up a lot, they will start moving down the ranks, and so they're worth less, or something else that will push people to keep adapting to the new reality, that keeps people from canalizing in whatever is cheapest and easiest. Anyway, that's a quick guess.
Right, we've got Richard and Kristen and the gentleman beside you.
So biodiversity is complicated. I've got that now. But so 38 of us here want to tackle scaling problems in our process-based models. So what advice have you got for scaling up, or perhaps I should say, what advice have you got for building these process-based models in order that we cope with these scaling problems?
So far, not much. My hope is that over the course of this month, that I I saw as my job is to throw out some of the questions and to see whether we as a community can come up with clever ways to incorporate some of this stuff. Because ultimately, part of what the history of this is an awful lot of money. I mean, I haven't done the sums recently. I did the sums a few years ago. Far more money has been spent on agro-environment schemes than was spent on nature conservation. And it's deemed to be conservation money, and it's accomplished almost no conservation. And a lot of money is going to be spent on the new one. And I think to a certain extent, if part of the justification for it is that this is going to be producing a public good of biodiversity conservation, I think it's incumbent on us to actually try to see whether it will conserve biodiversity, and to try to make sure that it does. And how exactly we do that, how we increase the, I suppose some of the advice is putting new habitat close to old habitat, trying to do translocations to try to speed the rate of colonization of new habitat, trying to there may be interventions. My old doctoral supervisor, Gordon Orians, used to talk about management for supersaturation. This notion that extinction that we now know takes a while to happen, are there ways we can keep kicking the system to stop it from the notion, they call this relaxation, that this overwrought community relaxes down to a more manageable number of species. Are there ways we can stop it from relaxing, that we can keep sort of poking it to keep it supersaturated? I don't know, but I think there are some issues that we need to deal with in terms of these larger scale processes of colonization and extinction that actually will be about trying to maintain the species richness and genetic diversity and community diversity of Britain. And if we're spending actual public money on it, we ought to be actually accomplish something with it. Yeah.
I think there's another question here beside before we go to John. But I have a very quick question. Yesterday we were talking about the need for simplification. And we need to do things now and quickly in parsimony.
Mm.
Do you reckon that you're upscaling stuff, or you're predicting, or you're downscaling stuff, where you're saying, can we take large-scale abundance or even occupational occupancy patterns as a proxy for fine-grain abundance? How far do you think we can go with that? Obviously, that's
well. Again, I think what we found empirically in Britain, and there are people all other parts of the world to say this isn't true, but certainly what we've found here is that we can basically get down to the level of a half a square kilometer or something like that. At which point, then it all breaks down, because all of a sudden you're talking about a landscape mosaic that's largely blocky, and then within those blocks it picks up again. If I still have some hope for combining that with a species distribution model to come up with something which tells you not only how much there is, but where it's likely to be, and that would, I think, be a step forward for both of them.
This gentleman here, that I think we've probably need to leave it to coffee because we're beginning to run over.
So coming at this as a non-ecologist,
Okay.
I'm not going to take exception to the comment that East Anglia is boring. It has been a very dynamic landscape, over many, many decades, as has much of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So given what you were talking about around these sort of systemic or these lags, as ecologists, when you're going out and measuring things in East Anglia, what are they representing the condition of? Because presumably some of those are relics from conditions pre-dig for victory. Some are...
Yeah, so certainly that plant is hiding in the Brecklands, and it's in a few nature reserves and in some bits of scrubby land outside of the nature reserves, and that's pretty much the only place it can live. And there's actually one population in a roadside verge, if I remember right, but there are a few places where it's managed to persist, and I think in general, a lot of what I work on is bees, right? I work on plants and bees mostly, and there's all this talk about what would happen if all the bees went extinct. All the bees aren't going to go extinct. A lot of the bees may go extinct, but they're the rare bees that aren't actually the ones pollinating our crops. So will we still have some biodiversity? Of course we will. There are lots of things that will persist in the Anthropocene. If part of what we're trying to do here is to save those things that wouldn't persist without our help, then it'll actually mostly be these rare things which aren't all that functionally important. They might be contributing to long-term resilience. Maybe they'll be important in some future climate or some future emission scenario or something. But right now they're not, and they're not likely to be next week or next year or next decade. But but ultimately, I think in this stuff, biodiversity conservation itself is being deemed to be a public good. And to the extent that's part of what we're trying to do, then it's these things that don't like living with us, but will tolerate us more or less if they have to. That we got to figure out ways to help them coexist with us. And a lot of the agro-environment money is being spent to maintain populations of cabbage white butterflies, which are not in any danger.
Actually, just while you set up, maybe just John can ask his question and then Bill can answer it. If we can get our IT person again.
So I was just going back to one of your early slides when you